It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be back in Montreal and to be at the CCA and to be part of this discussion of photography and architecture. And as you can see, I prepared the PowerPoint before the change of the title, so we have the old title there. But I'm just as happy with the other one. So I'm an architectural and urban historian, and I not only use photographs in my research, and not just as documents, but actually as interpretive works, as artifacts. They're very much a part of my research. They're very much a part of architecture and certainly of urbanism. But also a major focus of my research is concerned with issues of representation themselves, and not just photography, actually. In particular, for the last little while, I've been very interested in how media technologies, the media technologies that we use to visualize and understand architecture and urban processes and practices, how they shape the way in which we understand those processes and practices, and the kinds of knowledge that our research produces. And that's what I'd like to look at today. And I'm going to do that first in a small case study from my own practice as an editor a while back that revealed something to me very important about the distinctive visual language of photography, or at least that's what I took away from it. And then I want to look very briefly at a current project, which is an urban research project, very much in process, that I'm directing at Harvard. And that's the sort of image that you have over there, an exhibition on urban intermedia. We're calling it City Archive Narrative. And so that project, actually, which is funded by the Mellon Foundation, explores the ways in which media technologies impact our encounter with the city, because I think that we all know this about how our encounter with the city is very much mediated these days, and also how we do research when there's an enormous quantity of visual data of different kinds, how we process it, how we can do different kinds of research with it that are dynamic, that are open-ended, that are multi-layered, and how we can produce new kinds of knowledge with it. So this is the sort of large project that we are sort of working with in this Mellon grant project. So I'm going to start with the case study. In 1994, when I was the exhibition review editor for the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, I was sent a review of an exhibition of photographs at Wesleyan University. Usually, as a review editor, you commission reviews, but this one actually came to me. So it was really interesting. I found that the circumstances of the review and of the exhibition and the review really fascinating and complicated and multi-layered. The review was a review of an exhibition that had originally taken place in 1934 and 1935. And the original exhibition had, and here you can see these are the catalog, the sort of title pages from those two catalogs. The original exhibition had two remarkable protagonists. The curator was Henry Russell Hitchcock, the famous architectural historian, one of the founding fathers of the discipline of architectural history in the United States, and also of the Society of Architectural Historians. And he was also famously at that point, too, co-curator with Philip Johnson of the International Style exhibition at MoMA in 1932. So it was 2 years before this. And the photographer was Berenice Abbott, one of the most important and interesting photographers of the modern city, whose work I knew from Changing New York and had met actually through the CCA at the conference that was held in connection with the CCA exhibition Architecture and Photography in, I believe it was 1983 or 4, something like that. Anyhow, so the second exhibition was in 1993, and it reproduced the original exhibition in its entirety. There were the same photographs, prints and mounts. There were the same wall labels and various other didactic materials, including maps of cities. Yet what was really interesting to me was that there was no consensus about what these photographs were about. The curators of the two exhibitions, Hitchcock and then the curator later at Wesleyan, disagreed fundamentally with each other, and then the reviewer disagreed also with both of them. So I was really intrigued by this. And these circumstances seem to say something important to me about photography as a medium and the visual narrative as a discursive format. And that's what I want to look at now, and it's a sort of critical context, in a way, for the project, the current project that I'll show right at the end. So the original show, here you have the two of them with the exhibition between them, was a small didactic exhibition of a photographic project. It was a photographic mission, actually, as one might call it. And it was conceived by Henry Russell Hitchcock, who was at the time a young professor at Wesleyan University, and he had started a series of architectural exhibitions at the university. And he was one of the first architectural historians, really, to recognize how important the exhibition could be as a teaching tool. The exhibition, as you could see, was called The Urban Vernacular of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, American Cities Before the Civil War. So the 30s, 40s, and 50s are the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, not the 19. And so it was before the Civil War, which means before 1864. Hitchcock had raised the money from the Carnegie Corporation and the College Art Association, and he commissioned Berenice Abbott to take the photographs in the summer of 1934. Now, Abbott, at that point, was 5 years into her own photographic project, Changing New York, which she began working on in 1929, so that Hitchcock's commission came shortly before she received the WPA Federal Art Project Grant, which, and actually in the Works Progress Administration Federal Art Project Grant, that actually enabled her to do the Changing New York project and to really expand it. And the two of them had met a few years before because they had both been involved in various different ways with MoMA. So the exhibition, and here I'm just going to show you some of the images from, these images are all taken from the 1993 catalog, which is the only one that I had access to, and so, they are what they are. So these are images of Boston. The exhibition as a whole was comprised of 50 photographs by Berenice Abbott of mid-19th century buildings in 5 cities. The 5 cities were Boston, New York, Baltimore, Charleston, and Philadelphia. And as I said, they were accompanied by maps. The maps were all of around 1850 that showed the locations of the buildings. And there were also 3 smaller sections, kind of random, that were about other cities and hotels and architects' drawings, and it was sort of hodgepodge. The exhibition was originally intended to travel to 8 universities, and 2 city museums. It ended up going to 5 universities and I think 2 museums. Now, Hitchcock's brief text in the catalog explained what the exhibition was about. And he wrote, "The photographs of urban vernacular buildings showed," and I quote here, "the generally high level of ordinary American building in the period before the Civil War, the quality of which, he noted, had declined rapidly after the Civil War. And the buildings were selected on the basis of their excellence and their relative freedom from later changes." This reminds me a little bit of the comments that Phyllis made at the opening of the exhibition, the Greystones exhibition, about the selection of the buildings in the exhibition. So, and here now are some of the New York images. Interestingly, the term urban vernacular was new at the time in the 1930s. Vernacular was usually not associated with the city. it was usually about towns or villages. And Hitchcock used it basically to signify urban fabric. I think this is a very interesting and important point. And he also used it to frame an argument that he articulated in the text. And that argument was that what makes a city, as opposed to a town or a village, is its urban fabric, are ordinary buildings, not its monuments. And this was a highly polemical statement at the time, and I'll come back to it. Here are some of the Baltimore images. He noted about Baltimore, for instance, that it was particularly notable for the row houses of all economic levels. Here are some images of the Charleston buildings, and he noted actually that much more of the downtown commercial vernacular had been preserved in this city and in the South than in most northern cities. And then another one was Philadelphia, where he said that the really interesting period in Philadelphia was earlier than this, but that there were some of the later buildings in this period, like with the brownstone facing, they were actually really interesting. Interestingly, also, Hitchcock had very little to say about Berenice Abbott at that time. He attributed the photographs to her, but he had said no more about her role or her contribution, although he did do that later. So here is the second exhibition. It was also started at Wesleyan, which is where this archive, actually, the photographs, is. So this is where the exhibition started. This is where the photographs are. This is where the whole project was centered. So this is the title page again, and these are some of the New York commercial buildings of the mid-1800s. The curator was Janine Milliffe, and she gave, as you can see, a new and clearly interpretive title to the exhibition. It was called, instead of vernacular buildings or vernacular architecture, it's Constructing Modernism, Berenice Abbott and Henry Russell Hitchcock. So I think that the title does a couple of things. It foregrounds Berenice Abbott, which is interesting, but it also constructs a new argument that is elaborated in the essay that she wrote and an architectural historian, Carla Yanni, who she invited to write an essay too. Now, the gist of that argument is that the exhibition is not actually about American urban vernacular architecture, as Hitchcock said it was. Instead, the photographs were actually, and this is their argument, part of a concerted effort to show that international style modernism that Hitchcock himself had celebrated 2 years earlier at MoMA in the Modern Architecture International Exhibition, that it was not a European import, but that it had deep American roots in indigenous urban vernacular buildings. So this is how the exhibition was reinterpreted, and this is an argument that would have appealed considerably to American isolationist attitudes of the time in the mid-30s. And Milliffe also claimed that the argument, and this is another interesting point, was largely made by Abbott's photographs. And she argued that Hitchcock had picked Abbott because of her realist approach to photography, but that after he had selected the buildings, Abbott had been fully in charge. And Abbott had made, in fact, all of the photographic decisions herself. She determined the format, she determined the content of the images beyond the buildings that Hitchcock chose, but she framed them. All of the buildings, also the way in which she photographed them, all of the buildings were photographed at eye level. They were shot exclusively during daytime. I mean, she did shoot, nighttime photographs elsewhere, but with a tripod that was placed at a standard distance from the subjects. And she also used standard vantage points, frontal, three-corner angle, and receding diagonally down the street. And so these Boston images show the full range of vantage points. Now, the resulting photographs, and I take you back to Baltimore here, she argued, made both the buildings and the cities look remarkably similar to each other. And they also emphasized qualities of the buildings that made them look like modernist buildings in the MoMA exhibition. And regular massing, large areas of glazing, simple forms, undecorated surfaces, and so on. And Abbott had also included a lot of contemporary reality in her photographs. This was the sort of discretionary part too. As you can see, there are cars, there's modern infrastructure, there's signs, there are posters. These buildings are very much depicted as they were. And these are Charleston and Boston images. And she also included a couple of photographs. She may have also included a couple of photographs from her own Changing New York project that these images became, or versions of them, became really iconic views in her work, in that particular work. So in the 1993 recreation of the 1934 and 35 exhibition, the curators interpreted Abbott's photographs as constructing a powerful visual argument in support of what they called the subtext of Hitchcock's exhibition text. And that subtext was that international-style modernism had indigenous American roots. So that's the second interpretation. There was also a third level of interpretation, and that was by the reviewer of the exhibition, who is the architectural historian Margis Bacon. And she declared this interpretation, along with the new title of the exhibition, to be not only false, but also inappropriate. And she said that Abbott's photographs and the visual text that they construct are not only not about establishing American historical roots for the international style in modern architecture, but they're also not actually about architectural form. And instead, she argued, they're about the city, and they're about urban morphology. Because why else, one of the arguments was, would Henry Russell Hitchcock and Bernice Abbott have included maps in the exhibition? Even if, as she also points out, they weren't particularly rigorous in identifying the sites accurately on those maps. But also, Abbott's photographs provide a mass of information about the organization, structure, and appearance of urban fabric and spaces in the cities, as well as about the city itself as it's changing. So, according to Bacon, the true subtext of the photographs and the visual narrative they construct was a polemic against demolition-based planning that privileged monuments over fabric. And as she explained, this was a very urgent issue in the 1930s. At the time, cities were receiving large infusions of New Deal funding for housing projects, and those housing projects were predicated on demolishing these old city cores, the fabric that is depicted in Abbott's photographs. So Margis Bacon's interpretation is that Abbott's photographs make a case for both preserving the urban cores of port cities and learning from their architecture, in particular about, and this is a quote from Henry Russell Hitchcock, which she requotes, about the sense of communal ordering in their design, the way in which they shape the city and the spaces of everyday life in it, which is what made them, and again quoting Hitchcock, a model for us today. So, okay, what does this tell us about the photographic medium and the visual text as a discursive format? First, I would say that it tells us that what we bring to photographs conditions the way in which we read them and the way in which we understand them. We read our own interests and concerns into them. And in general, it also points out, I'm sorry to say, that most academics are more skilled at reading verbal texts than they are at reading visual texts, and that actually verbal texts are much easier to decipher than visual texts. They're much more straightforward, less ambiguous than visual texts. And this is largely, and this is something that I've gotten quite interested in sort of looking at visual texts and images. This is largely because visual images have what in linguistics and in media theory is called analog surplus value. This is a wonderful concept. What it means is that visual images contain potentially a far greater amount of information than verbal statements. For example, an image of a cup of coffee gives you a great deal more information than the words cup of coffee do. You get information about the kind of cup, the shape of the cup, how full it is, what the color is, whether there's milk in it, there's all of these things. This is this analog surplus value that photographs have. And it's interesting that, for instance, just to take an example from that collection, here's one of the Boston images, and the caption is Custom House Street at corner of India Street. And of course, there's a ton, much more information than appears in the caption. So I would say that it's the analog surplus value of visual images that opens them up to these multiple readings that occurred in this review. And it also, interestingly, allows them to keep producing new meanings. And I think that one of the most interesting tropes of the historians and the curators' dispute about meanings is their use of this term, the subtext. They all refer to, well, that's the text, but this is the subtext. And the subtext, which describes something that's not articulated in the text itself, and that unarticulate, sort of hidden, nonverbal text, I would argue, is the visual text of the photographs, which they invoke, these historians and curators, when they actually start to read the photographs. So I think that ultimately what this little case study shows is that photographs and visual texts, we all know this, have no fixed meaning because their meaning is co-constructed with the viewer or the user of the image. And of course, this does not discount the intentionality of the photographer, but once the photograph is out in the world, it has a life of its own. So each image is filled with visual information, and while it is indexical, it is a record of a particular moment and a place and an object, it's also radically open to multiple readings and to the construction of new meanings by a critical viewer or user. And there's another point about images and visual texts, and that is that, as I said at the beginning, they tend to become layered onto the cities themselves. They become lenses through which we see and experience and understand urban environments. At least if we don't see them through them, they impact the way in which we do see them. And so this is where I'm going to turn to this Harvard project that I'm working on. I'm just going to show you a few minutes of this. This is this Harvard Mellon Urban Initiative where we're exploring ways in which media shape our encounters with cities and the kinds of knowledge that our research produces about them. And it's part of, this is a diagram of just how we were starting to think about how to lay out thinking. This is not an actual physical exhibition, but of how various different kinds of images relate to each other and how one might start to tell stories with them without words. It's part of a larger project at this Mellon thing, which is to develop interdisciplinary methods and also intermedia approaches to the study of urban environments. We've been doing research in 4 cities, Berlin, Boston, Istanbul, and Mumbai. We've been exploring a range of themes that cut across these cities and across cultures and geographies. I don't have time to go into that, but currently we're preparing an exhibition which is called Urban Intermedia City Archive Narrative, that presents the findings of the research that we've been conducting over the last 4 years, but it itself is also a research project and an experiment in methodology. It is very experimental. It makes one quite sort of nervous about it. We use a whole range of technologies to bring physical and digital media into dialogue and registration with each other so that they actually interact at the deepest structural levels and start to share properties. And we create what we call these intermedia narratives that tell a range of stories about the cities we look at them historically, spatially, and a number of other perspectives. And one of the interesting things that happens is that our approach seems to lead us to blind spots of urban research, to things, to topics and sites that are outside of conventional narratives about cities, and also outside dominant frameworks. And that's an interesting thing that we hadn't expected, but that is happening. And what I'm going to show you now is a few minutes of one of the narratives. The narratives themselves are all composed of digitized archival and contemporary photographs, drawings, maps, animations, documents, texts, videos, film footage, and so on that we gathered and used in our fieldwork and our archival research. And the narratives unfold in place and time. And in the exhibition, and I'll show you how that happens, they're projected onto silicone screens. And I'm going to show you a piece of one of the Berlin ones, which I've been sort of directing more or less, where we look at, and I think maybe I'll just sort of start with that and talk over it. So here, what we're doing is, this is a segment that is looking at the interrelation of the planned and the unplanned in the district of Luisenstadt in Berlin. And what we're seeing is how a new scale of block, city block, was developed in this plan, and that it changed the way in which space was used and organized in the city. And so we're bringing together media that explain that we used for the research. So we're showing that this is the old block, the scale of the old block in Berlin. And you see public infrastructure is yellow and industry is green and industry is yellow. And how this, having been outside the block, gets inserted into the city block so that public infrastructure and private industry start to inhabit the block. So we look at it in the maps, and then we look at it through a range of other media, photography. We go into the block, and we are trying to find, sort of articulate the experience of what is happening there. And the green indicates that it's part of the social infrastructure. I'm afraid we speeded up this because I didn't want to take too much time, but it makes it a little hard to grasp, but anyhow. So we gather a whole range of media together to tell these stories. Here we've been looking at the social infrastructure in the block, and then this is the private industry that locates itself inside the block. And extraordinary things were made inside the blocks. In fact, a lot of architectural toys. But also incredible experimentation with flying machines and so on going on inside the block, so that these became these sort of innovation kind of districts within the block itself. And so we show, one of the things that is part of our method here is that no piece of media ever disappears. They all stay there. So what we show is that this new scale of block, which developed in that little triangular part of the city, then expanded and was proliferated to the whole rest of the city, the extension of the city, and along with it, the mix of uses that happened inside the block. So this is one way in which we're working to sort of use media to tell stories. And one of the interesting things that we're doing with it is that, and this is an image from an Istanbul narrative, where we are telling these stories with media, but we also have a lower register that you could see down here, which we're calling dashboards, where each piece of media, each document, is identified along with the archival or other source, so that each object retains its integrity, its historical and materially, as a historically and materially specific object and a work. And the idea of the narratives is that by going back and forth between the city and the archive, one can construct a multitude of different narratives, and that any story that is told, that one tells through these objects, is open to multiple interpretations and revisions. But you have to construct a story. It's not an interactive process. And these are the screens, and this is how each city has one of these objects. Here there's a city plan. The plans in relief are on these structures. This is the sort of dashboard thing, and the narratives are on the screens above. So this is an experiment that is very much in process of trying to figure out ways of bringing media together and seeing how one might create different kinds of historical and other forms of research. Thank you.
Eve, that was absolutely great. And the second part bears a lot of thinking about, and we'll talk about it some, but the initial part, first of all, of course, Hitchcock was involved with one of our projects, but that's not the point. The point is that the buildings of the before 1865 were very much like the buildings here, but not as elegant and not as elaborate. Very interesting question, why? What was happening? Another thing to work on. But I want to talk, first of all, I want to say what an extraordinary evening this is for me, because Eve was our first curator of collections, of exhibitions, and she did the first exhibitions here at the CCA. And Richard, I've been working with him Eve was working at CCA in the 1980s, sorry, the 1980s. And Richard, I'm getting some water, I think. Richard and I started working together in about 1970s. We argue about the difference of the date when we started working in Montreal. And what is interesting, what I want to point out, is a very different way of constructing photographs of the city. The other question is, okay, you commission Berenice Abbott to do these photographs, and you tell her what to do, okay? We had two projects that I did with Richard. First was the Montreal Greystone project, which is in the gallery next to this room. And we started that project because I was interested. I knew Richard in Chicago. I knew his work as a photographer. He was just beginning, really, he was doing his master's, I believe, at the Art Institute of Chicago. And I was taking courses in urban history. Thank you. And wanted to go from the theoretical to the sort of haptic, to the actual sense of the city, the walking in the city, of how the city grew, really. And we started to photograph. And how did we start? The question is, okay, I'm sorry, first of all, I want to contrast that with the courthouse project, because one is at one scale, one is at the other. The Montreal project is of, well, first of all, you have to, I have my points here, but I'm confusing them all. I'll try to deconfuse. The question is, how do you do this, okay? How do you approach this? Well, one way is to say, okay, I'm going to do with one constant. And the constant was material here, and in courthouse, material in the city, and in courthouse was, of course, a building type across the country. So the scale is different, but the way of analyzing it is also different. But in Montreal, the question, as I said, was how the city grew, and in courthouse was the change of representation in the buildings across the country. In the east, there was the tradition of the strong box, and as that moved along, in Boston, that was in Virginia, in Boston, there was the meeting house, and then this changed completely across the country with time, with the great growth of cities, etc. Both cases, we had no knowledge, very little tiny bit of knowledge about photography. I had been using a camera for some time and using a 35 millimeter camera, and I felt that to make these photographs, one needed a chamber camera to be able to tilt the back so that you don't get distortion. And I took a couple of lessons in doing it, and I found it a bit fastidious. And so Richard has started to work with a chamber camera, and actually at that time that wasn't used much. And when we did courthouse, we insisted that everybody did do so, and one person did not, but otherwise that was all. So that we were kind of initiating the reuse of the chamber camera. Then the question is, how do you go about identifying the buildings that you're going to take? Henry Russell Hitchcock had his ideas of what they were. In Montreal, I grew up here. I had been away for many, many years, about 30 years. And I knew that I liked the gray stone buildings because I'd passed them, these long gray stone buildings. It seemed to me there was a real quality to them. And so I used the telephone book to find the presbyteries, because where there was a presbytery, there was a church, and where there was a church and a presbytery, there were gray stone buildings. There was an idea that buildings that related to religious orders, at least, were in gray stone, basically, in Montreal. Then in the courthouse project, Richard will talk about that later, but the question was, again, there was no book on it, and there wasn't very much known, and we chose the county courthouse rather than the federal courthouse, because the county courthouse was a local affair, and so they were different. A federal courthouse, you probably have the same architect doing many of them, and in some of the counties you indeed had, like in Texas, there was one architect who did pretty well all the county courthouses there, but of course that was quite different from the photographs, or from the buildings in the other states. And what Richard did was there were 3,043 counties in the United States, and so I think he wrote to all of them, and we photographed about 1,000 of them. And then, of course, in this process of doing the Montreal buildings and in doing the courthouse buildings, one gets to learn an enormous amount about the buildings. Certainly just in the textual issues, especially getting this information from the various counties, was something in Montreal that was really the only work that was done at that time on the buildings in Montreal was by the federal government that was documenting buildings that were going to be knocked down in Montreal and in Quebec. So that it was there really was nothing. There was Jean-Claude Marsan was coming out with his book on secondary sources, and that was useful because nobody knew anything about the growth of the city. The question is then, what do you learn about in doing so? Well, I think Eve put it very interestingly, because it's a little bit like you learn what you know, how you're oriented. You learn with what knowledge you have to be able to interpret this information. And it's always a little bit like a lot of sand that you have in your hand. You can take it and organize it by color or by size, by shape. And if you are a chemist, then you can actually do it by the various chemical components of thing. The Montreal buildings and the courthouse buildings both, as I said, there was one in Texas. There was one architect who did kind of a group of the courthouses there. But of course, the time that the buildings were built in both Montreal and in the United States, you judge that. You start to look at why people, how they connect, what the differences are. So, but you can only do that you do it in the field, but you could then only do that if you have the photographs in front of you. Because to be able to understand what the city is or what the country is, what the courthouse is, you need all those comparative methods. So you're coming back to, it's sort of a backwards affair. You're not starting off with a known quantity that you're going to go out and photograph, but you're starting off with the idea of trying to learn about what the courthouses were in the United States, how they changed, how they expressed the society, and similarly in Montreal. So with that, I'm going to leave you, and I think Richard is now going to talk about courthouse and other issues, of course.
Setting up projects. The first one, of course, was the Greystone project that Phyllis and I started working on, and somehow or other that set up a form to construct the idea of a larger project. We did it, as I recall, at any rate, largely serendipitously almost, by driving. Phyllis found the presbyteries and we went to look at each neighborhood and then drove down literally all the streets, working out where the buildings were and then working out where they should be and where the sun would be at particular times. And I remember even making special flights up to Montreal when Phyllis would call and say, it's going to be snowing, we can get the picture with the snow on the top of the wall. And these kind of details about the way the buildings were presented, both from the point of view and in the terms of the weather and waiting for the winter when the leaves were off the trees, it all became very crucial to the way the project evolved. If you look at the pictures on the wall next door, you'll see that almost everything is done in the winter, because once the leaves come out, you can't see the buildings anymore.
That wasn't why.
That wasn't why, no, but it was a contributing factor. Anyway, right. So then that came to an end, and I was thinking about what to do next. And in theory, I was going to take a job in Rochester at the Eastman House to do an exhibition on industrial photography, and for whatever reason, that collapsed. And I was really pretty desperate looking for what to do next, and Phyllis called up and said, well, why don't you come and see me? I've got an idea I'd like to talk to you about. And this is in Chicago. I was still living there. And it was the courthouse project. And so I arrived duly at 8:60, and we sat down and discussed it. And she said, well, sit down and I'll see how much money I can get for the project. And she called up the chairman of the board and pitched the project, and Jack said, yes, that sounds interesting. How much money would you like? And to my amazement, Phyllis asked for $250,000, which is a great deal of money in 1974. And so I asked her at the end of the conversation whether she thought that I was up to this, and she said that she was, and that we should begin. So we started off, we went to see people like John Tchaikovsky, Aaron Siskind, and Alan Fern at the Library of Congress. Tchaikovsky was the curator of photographs at MoMA and did this first exhibition. I think it was the only exhibition he actually did in 1976 for the Bicentennial Project. And each of these people pitched different ideas about how to approach it. And in a way, I think that probably the trip to the Library of Congress was the most useful, because at the same trip I started rummaging through the FSA drawers, Foreign Security Administration, in which Walker Evans and Ben Shahn and so many, Arthur Rothstein, Marion Post Walcott, did absolutely astonishing work. And even the way that archive was organized, it was the original cataloging system had been set up by Paul Vanderbilt. So I went to see Paul Vanderbilt, who was in Chicago then, or near Chicago, he's in Wisconsin. And he had gone and set up the photographic archive at the Historical Society in Wisconsin. So I talked to him about how you organized this sort of project. And he was actually one of the photographers who worked on the project, and it was nice to have that continuum, because he was the last photographer that Stryker had for the photography of the FSA, and he moved from being a photographer into organizing that material. And then he took that experience to Wisconsin and organized the historical collection there. So this all provided some ideas about how you might begin, but then we began to find that we didn't know anything about the subject. I mean, I went to places like the National Register of Historic Places and the Historic American Building Survey in Washington, federal organizations, looking to see what they had on the subject, and there was nothing, very little, mostly scattered around the East Coast. And it was near, I mean, my original idea was that we'd do a pilot in Virginia, but I went to look at Virginia, and then everything there was kind of neoclassical, and it seemed much too narrow a way of constructing the initial steps of the project to get something to build on. So in the end, I found out that there was a PhD thesis produced by guy in Texas. I've forgotten his name. I can't remember his name offhand. But he'd done this very thick Xerox thesis published on demand on Texas and Indiana. And Indiana had special dispensations in the state law whereby a county could issue a mandate and take a levy of taxes to build a new courthouse almost arbitrarily according to the whim of the county board and the commissioners. So there was this extraordinary kind of one-upmanship that went on. I've got a few slides that are not particularly related to beyond anything to just show some of the range of the subject and the ways we approached it. This is St. Louis. There was Bill Clift working on the dome of the courthouse, and you're seeing it reflected in this completely nondescript mirrored building, which is transformed by the architecture around it. And they went from the very grand, like this one in Philadelphia, which was the tallest building in the town. The sculpture on the top is by Alexander Calder's father. And here we are with one of the few Beaux-Arts courthouses in Indiana again. And then it's Nick Nixon in Boston. And then there's this other end of the story. So we began by when I sent out all these letters, I think I sent out about 4,500 letters, and I signed them all myself, which seems quite mad now. But it did make a terrific difference because we got an extraordinary response, very high percentage. And when you send out mass mailings, you expect something like 1.5% in return. And I think we got replies from well over 2,000 of the counties. And we wrote to the people like the Daughters of the American Revolution, local bar association, every county, of course, the local historical societies, asking for any kind of information that they had on the courthouse, pictures if they had them. We got everything from commemorative plates and ashtrays, postcards. People would run out on the lawn and make a snapshot and send us a little print. And this all went into files that we organized by state and by county. And then I started constructing itineraries for the photographers. At the height, there were about 12 or 13 photographers out on the road at once. And I was completely engaged in reviewing and organizing the material as it came in, and then going from there into looking at the material and evaluating it and constructing my mental picture of what the subject was and trying to work out what was missing from that picture, and sending out memoranda to all the different photographers with my ideas about the kind of subjects that they could be looking at. And there was no directive to say that they should look for this, but please, if you would like to think about these ideas, see where it will take you. And the results were produced pictures like this one of Jim's of the local election, and Wally Sloan is running for jailer, and he's got his signs up on more than one occasion. And you can more or less tell the pecking order of the political people who are running for the election and how potent they are by the size of their signs. And then very charming little rustic versions of classical construction like this one. And this is Jim Dow, who was one of Walker Evans's students and friends. He did a lot of the later printing. He did all of the printing for Walker Evans' exhibition retrospective that Tchaikovsky did at the Museum of Modern Art. This is Bill Clift. I showed this one to John Tchaikovsky, and he said, the dissenting juror struck by lightning. This is Terry Thompson, another of Walker Evans's students and companion at the end of his life. And it's very much influenced by Evans in the way the picture is seen and constructed, even the format of the image. It's a very beautiful photograph, I think. This is me. This is the debtor's jail in King William County in Virginia. And this was the fate of a courthouse and what it got replaced with. And this was by Bob Thal. So in the end, after 4 years of pretty intensive labor, we were ready to get the book to go to the publisher, and it came out in 1978. It was extraordinarily well received. There was a joint exhibition that went out in two copies, rather, is what I meant to say, that circulated all around the country for another 4 years after that. It traveled abroad, it went to England. The press coverage was absolutely astonishing. I did a trip set up by a British woman who had absolutely no concept of the sheer scale of the United States, and she would set me up with 250 miles driving in a single day and 4 appointments, talking about it, everything on for 20-second slots on TV evening news, local evening news, to 3.5-hour lectures in Colorado. So based on the courthouse project, I then moved back eventually into being a photographer myself again. And after spending 15 years building Phyllis's collection of photographs that was to become the collection here of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, it began essentially in a very small way with an afternoon visit to Lucien Goldschmidt, who's one of the great antiquarian book dealers in New York. And he had this exquisitely beautiful photograph by Robert McPherson. I looked at it again this afternoon just to refresh my memory. And that was the first picture that we bought. And as Phyllis was leaving, she said, well, why don't you see if you can find anything else? And 15 years later, there were nearly 49,000 pictures in the collection. So it grew very rapidly. It was a kind of perfect intersection of the moment of the revival of interest in photography in the 19th century and the early history of photography. And people were interested enough in it that the market set a price that people thought it worthwhile to go and rummage in the attic and see what they could find. And there's an amazing outpouring of extraordinary material that seemed to be very finite. But then that all began to change, and I was chafing, I think, a bit to get back to being a photographer again. But I still kept on paying attention, and by '93, I had ceased being the curator here full-time, but was still advising, and I went to this exhibition, the annual photography show at the fair in New York in January, and was looking around, and I saw this extraordinary picture of Tatlin and his assistants building the model for the Tower for the Third International. And it's a picture that I knew because it's on the cover of Catherine Cook's book, which is one of the key documents that I based all the work on, but never expected to see a real print of it. But there it was, and so I turned around, and it was a dealer I'd known for many years. I said, "Oh, Howard, where did you get that?" And he said, "Oh, I've been going in and out of Moscow." And so I said, "Oh, I've always wanted to go to Russia." And he said, "Well, why don't you come with me the next time?" And he was as good as his word, and I went there, and he introduced me to all his contacts. And I started looking around at the modernist legacy, essentially. And I used all the experience that I'd gained on working here with Phyllis on the Greystones and in the evolution of the Courthouse project, and then further still in developing the collection for the photography collection here, and applied all of that knowledge to what I was doing in Russia. But at the same time, I knew that there was this great gap in the collection of Russian material to do with the modernist and constructivist movement. And one of the things that I don't understand, which is a bit of an aside, is that why when Hitchcock and Johnson did the show on the international style at MoMA, they completely left out the Russians. And it wasn't that they didn't know. Johnson had been to Russia, and Alfred Barr had been to Russia, and so they did know about the material. So there was some kind of conscious, possibly political decision to leave the Russians out. And they remained left out of this picture basically until I started looking, because it became a non-subject in Russia too after 1932. Stalin threw down the gauntlet and collapsed all these architects' associations into the single House of Architects in Moscow. And that was when the Russian Museum of Architecture, the Museum of Architecture in Moscow, which is near the Kremlin, was set up. And it was more not as a museum, but as a cell to lock up all the material to keep it out of people's way. But it's an astonishing collection, and it has the Leonidov archive amongst many other things in there, and plus all the great rendering drawings for the Seven Sisters in Moscow, which was the Stalinist answer to modernism. But nobody knew anything about the modernist legacy, and so this is the image itself. And I chose this as the cover image for the book because it was the first major structure completed after the revolution, though Zhukov had been building these hyperbolites of rotation, is what the engineering term is, that he invented, incidentally. And the first one was built in Nizhny Novgorod for a Wells Fair there 3 years before the Eiffel Tower went up in Paris. And the other amazing thing about the Shabalaka radio shower, again, and it's an aside, had it been built at its full height, it would have been taller than the Eiffel Tower, slightly shorter than the Woolworth building that was then the tallest building in the world, and it would have weighed 1/4 of the weight of the Eiffel Tower in terms of materials used. So the story began, and this was the first constructivist building put out. The decorations were done by Rodchenko, and this was a reconstruction of the original wall paintings that was done in commemoration of one or another centenary of Moscow. I can't remember which one offhand now. This was the Mogias Power Station. There's a famous Rodchenko photograph of this with a horse and cart delivering building materials. And I knew it existed, but because you can see the other side, which is of a much more neoclassical kind of structure, and the architect here threw caution to the winds because nobody could see this from the street. But I couldn't get in. I couldn't find out how to get permission to get through the door. And eventually I persuaded one of the people from the Ministry of Culture who I was driving with just to go in and ask whether she could see whether the bays were still there, and they let her in because she was a local person, she was from the government, and she came back and told me that indeed it was. And then the Deputy Minister of Culture managed to get me permission to go in and see it. And since this picture was taken, the great bays have all been ripped away, and the structure is effectively destroyed. This is the Izvestia building, this Barkin's only building in Moscow. As far as we know, there's only one other building that he managed to complete, which is a maternity clinic down in the Crimea, which I've seen also. And this was quite early on when I was there, and a bit later on various floors were moved. This is the same structure, believe it or not, what it looked like a few years later. And it shows you what the level of regard was for the modernist legacy. But since then, I'm pleased to be able to tell you that it's now been restored again back to its original status and is now in much better shape. But the old press room is now a nightclub. And they've bashed through the curtain wall at the front, and on the left is a Costa Coffee, and on the right is a McDonald's or something, which is kind of sad. This is Korb's great entry lobby to the Centre-Soyeuse, which has again been renovated somewhat insensitively since this picture was made. This was when it was still untouched, essentially. Melnikov's magical house that is now, I'm pleased to be able to tell you again, secured after hanging in the balance literally from the very beginning of its construction. It's an extraordinary story. It's the only private house built in Moscow after the revolution until now, probably. At least probably some oligarchs are building themselves private palaces here and there, but until a decade ago, this was the only private house constructed in Russia. And the first bomb that fell on Moscow in the Second World War blew all the windows out because it was right near the foreign ministry. And so the family lived in the potato cellar in the basement for the duration. And then Melnikov fell out of favor for all kinds of complicated reasons. But because of his status as having designed the sarcophagus for Lenin, the original one, which is no longer there, he sort of pulled rank and managed to continue to live in the house, and he had a modest state pension. He was allowed to teach painting, but not architecture. He's made a lot of money on to sort of keep the family alive by building stoves. He was very good at calculating drafts, apparently, and could build a really effective and useful stove. This is probably one of my favorite pictures out of the whole project. It's the interior of Ginsberg's Narkomfin, which is an astonishing structure. It's built on very Corbusian principles. Corb published Vers en Architecture. Ginsberg read a copy and wrote a response to it. And then Corb arrived in Moscow for the meetings about the Centre-Soyeuse, and Ginsberg gave him a set of the drawings for Narkomfin, which was completed by then, which Corb went away and took back to Paris with him and put them in the drawer. And it's very evident that when you look at the plans and the way the apartments work and everything in Marseille at the Unité owes a great debt to this building. This is the roof. It's a kind of portmanteau picture that shows all the 20th century in one image. In the foreground is, believe it or not, the oldest building, which is the Ginsberg building. In the far distance is one of the Seven Sisters that was constructed in the 40s. In the extreme right is the White House, built in the 1960s. Between the ventilator and the roof area over here, this is the new American Embassy, which is within spitting distance, and it was constructed in the 80s, I think, and it's hardly ever been used because there were so many bugs built into the walls that they couldn't ever talk to anybody there. But the building is still standing there, and I think again that at last it seems to be about to undergo a major restoration job to put it back into good order. And it's going to be turned into a boutique hotel, which seems to be somewhat ironical, as it was built as a communal house for people who worked in the Ministry of Finance. My project finished with the Lenin Mausoleum, so you go from the openness and transparency of the radio tower about spreading the word and the new revolution and the hope and optimism of socialism to the heart of darkness. And that's Lenin's right hand in the sarcophagus. That is not the Melnikov sarcophagus. And that's the exterior. And there were like two bookends for the project. You begin with openness and transparency and conclude with the kind of the iron fist. No velvet glove either. And just to change the mood a little bit, I'm now working on a major compendium on as much as I can see of Corbusier's work. I'm very near the end of the road. I've got one house that I think I finally got permission to see in Ahmedabad in India, and the Unité in Berlin, and then I'm done. And it should be out later this year. But the reason I picked this one, which is of course the Villa Savoye, was because a bit later on, and I'm sure I must have known this drawing, but I hadn't really paid attention to it in quite the same way, I found that Corb had pushed me into the very same position from which he conceived the building before it even existed. And it was just such a pleasure to find the two coinciding so nicely. So there we are.
Thank you all so very much. That was a very interesting kind of rich broth of the various ways in which we can plan the production and organize the creation of so many photographs, and then also the layers of interpretation that they can provide, and the kind of coincidences and discoveries that come about. So I have the kind of unfortunate task of trying to pick a few directions from this and to guide our conversation. So I thought maybe we could start with a few terms, to define a few terms. I mean, I really like this idea of the photographic mission. And I think that we've talked about it maybe before, but I don't know that it's familiar to everyone. And I'm also curious, you know, if you decided, when did you sort of discover it? When did you decide to call your project a photographic mission? And were you on a photographic mission before you labeled it that?
I just called it a mission recently when I was doing this exhibition, because what was I going to say? It was just started as a weekend project. Is this on?
Yeah, it should be. Yeah.
Okay.
Just
it started as a weekend project and went on for a couple of years. And Richard said call it project, but project is used for everything. So we just called it courthouse. Courthouse. No, that was courthouse. Greystone. Yeah.
I mean, it's always very risky to try and correct you, but I read your essay in the courthouse book, and there already you're referring to the idea of the photographic mission, and in fact pointing out that it has these two histories. No, the American.
Well, that's after we learned something about the history of photography. You know, it was kind of, there were always missions. There were missions in the 1830s. You know, so that was a great tradition of that. I guess a mission is a setting out to do a study of. It can be of very different kinds. Eve, why do you call yours a mission?
Oh, well, I don't. But I think that what is nice about the mission is that it implies a purpose, right? That you actually have an objective in mind, and that it is a mission. You're a missionary. Yes, exactly.
That's one association, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a wonderful term, I think. And I think that all of these projects have that kind of missionary zeal in them. And so.
I think something that's interesting about that missionary zeal, too, is that they all ended up with concern for they all brought, and it didn't end up, they just brought this concern for conservation. And that Richard's last photograph of the courthouse with there's 4 columns standing in front of a 1950s nothing building. And when we were photographing here in Montreal, I remember we were at the Grey Nuns. No, was it the Grey Nuns? No, it was a Hotel Dieu. And we were cold, so we went inside the building to warm up. And people, the nuns came in and said, "What are you photographing this building for? It's going to go, These are old buildings." So, but I think the Hitchcock and Berenice Abbott also had that aspect. I think that is a kind of there's a very strong grain of that in the history of photography.
The courthouse project eventually ended up being given to the Library of Congress, fully organized and cataloged, so that it could if we just handed it over raw, it would still be sitting in boxes. But because it's completely organized and all the documentary material went with it, it's been used a great deal. I mean, I've talked to Ford Petrus about it several times to just ask him whether it's useful, and people are coming to see and make use of the images, and he tells me, yes, indeed it is. And it seemed like the absolutely most appropriate place where it could possibly be, because it's sitting there alongside the FSA material.
Yes, but you initially wanted to give it to
Eastman House.
Yes, Eastman House. Yeah. And I was completely against that.
Yeah, me too. And ultimately, it just didn't seem like a good idea when we investigated it a bit further.
Even after they jip you out of that job, you wanted to give it to them.
Well, I mean, it still is one of the major collections about the history of photography in the world. But the Courthouse project is much deeper than that. It's much more than just a photographic archive, which is the whole pleasure of it. It's the idea of expanding on the function of the courthouse in American society over a couple of centuries was just amazing, because if you go through it, there's log cabins, there's latest buildings, the one in Minneapolis, which is, I've forgotten who it's by, Warnicki did it. But there are very few, and there's one by Frank Lloyd Wright. But the guy who was in Texas...
You're talking about contemporary.
Yeah, was James Riley Gordon, was the architect who did the ones in Texas that Phyllis was talking about. And he used the same pattern, exactly. There's about half a dozen courthouses within 100 miles of each other with the same ground plan. And according to the budget, there's more or less elaboration of the details, but otherwise it was easy work for him. And there were wonderful scandals. There's one house. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I could go on. Yeah.
The question of giving it to Eastman House made me think of something, which is that there's this, you produce the work, right? We talked about this earlier, producing the work, perhaps making a book, doing an exhibition. There's these sort of moments of activation when you're still involved, especially as a photographer. Yeah. And then at some point you talked about letting it go, letting it out of your hands. Right. So to me it seems like that's one strategy, is giving it to an institution that you know will do something with it.
Yeah, I mean...
the CCA didn't exist then, but it would have been... We selected a number of photographs to give to various institutions. So we have a whole collection of the courthouse photographs here, but not with all that wonderful documentation. And I think that even in the Library of Congress, there's all of the maps that you did to show where the, it was just a very full, and all the documentation behind that, which of course we have for the Greystone building.
Right. No, I really like this image of Richard as a kind of a taxi dispatcher. I picture you in a tower for some reason in New York.
Yeah,
tracking all the photographers.
Even in the weekends when the air conditioning was off, it was excruciatingly hot in the summer, and I was on the phone. The phone was an incredible tool. I mean, there was no email, of course.
Or the phone book.
No, yeah, right. I mean, I was just talking to the photographers about the work they were sending in. When it started off, they'd send me in their contacts, and there were only 2 3 people out on the road, so I took all the pictures and cut them apart, pasted them together again, draw extensions on the left and right, saying, well, what was happening here? Why did you crop the picture here? And just getting them to think about both the technical aspect, because a lot of them hadn't done any architectural photography before either. I mean, Todd Papajor's never used a 4x5 camera before, and it took him a couple of weeks to figure out how to turn the back to make a vertical or a horizontal. And so I was teaching the technical end of the photography as well as getting them to think about the subject. And it seemed to me, I mean, another thing that's a little bit crazy and wonderful about that project is that it was dreamed up by a Canadian and exercised by an Englishman. And it was for the American bicentennial. So it was, there was great pleasure in that, in a way. And it was wonderful to be suddenly immersed in this core structure about American history. And in the course of the project and putting it together and then the publicity thing afterwards and other travels before, I've set foot in 48 states, which I think is not it sort of informed my view about America in a way, and made it possible to take on the Russian project, which is even bigger in terms of its geographical spread.
Well, I think there's something very interesting about these projects, that is, they're covering a group of people or one photographer, but they're all at the same time. And so I think the Greystone exhibition here, which is only 3 a part of the city. There are lots more other photographs, but just couldn't get to doing all of that. But there's a coherence about the city. And what's also interesting is that the buildings in the buildings in the Hitchcock, Berenice Abbott, look very dowdy and very unhappy, but that's what the buildings here looked like in the 30s. Also, they were absolutely appalling. You know, the government, the province wanted to put a highway right through Rue Saint-Paul, and you can see from actually there's a book out by Dino Bumperu did with somebody at La Presse, press photographs of the time, and in there you see these buildings with these terrible signs around them and just so neglected. And so by the time we took these in the early 1970s, 71, 72, 73, whatever the date is, but we, you know, the province had then listed, and it was protected. The whole old Montreal was protected, and so people started looking up to the buildings, and so it was a very big change.
Yeah, at one point, Richard, I think in your essay in Courthouse, you talk about this sort of virtuous circle of producing the photographs, and then people start to respect the buildings, and then they kind of preserve them, and then they take even more photographs, and you kind of start this thing going.
Yeah, well, it was a bit of a two-edged sword in some ways, because, I mean, I'm aware that quite a few of the buildings have either been destroyed or they've moved the courthouse out into new premises, and the old building is sitting there with a lot of very bad renovations going on inside, and a lot of the kind of character and the sheer sort of detail and the attention to the way things come together has been stripped away, and you know, people have gone in and put in drop ceilings and painted everything, and it's replaced the chairs in the courtroom with new ugly stuff that's going to fall apart in 20 years instead of stuff that had been there for 100 and was still perfectly good. You know.
Well, maybe Eve could talk a little bit about this idea that you brought up very succinctly of the sort of photographic text, of the multiplicity of meanings and data that's in one image. As Phyllis was just making a comment about how the buildings look dowdy and these other things, and this is because of your knowledge of how to read these things. So especially as a teacher, How do you teach the sort of the ability to read a photographic text?
Well, it's interesting. I think that it's very much a part. We use photographs as documents, as historians mostly, and I think that also these missions have been understood as documentation. Your mission, the other missions, that it's producing documents that actually have the same sort of value or valence, actually, as a written document. But they don't. They're very different. And I think that that's very important, that they have, that they keep producing new meanings, whereas as written texts are pretty clear about what they are. They can, produce new meanings, but with photographs and other visual materials, that each person who comes to it sees something in it. And to me, it seems to be an integral part of what architecture is all about, too. And that architecture is the same way. It's also, it's designed, but once it's out there, it becomes part of the lived experience of the city. And people, it changes, and the meaning, like the meaning of the photograph changes, and the idea about the photograph as people experience it. And so that these are really living documents. They're not documents, they're works. They are real artifacts. And I see them as not being documents that tell us about buildings, but they are part of, they work with the buildings, and they are about, the buildings are, they all speak about each other, actually. And I think that that's one of the things that certainly these days, with the proliferation of different media formats and the availability of media, so much of it is a part of the way in which we actually experience and live. I mean, you go on these trips, these traveling with students, for instance, in Istanbul and various places, and we sit down to eat, and everybody takes a picture of their plate, for instance, and those get circulated across the world. And so that, and I think that understanding how that changes not only a sense of place, but also a sense of time, is very important, and that all of these media, and you can call architecture a medium too, or a set of media, are interrelated. And I think that that's something that is very important, and that we are becoming very aware of now, as we live with this kind of virtual world that is totally integrated into the physical world.
Do you trust any of these media more than any others? I mean, buildings have always been expressed through drawings and photos and models and
Yeah, actually, I mean, that's one of the really interesting things that I find, that of all the media, that the ones that I really trust are buildings, actually, because they are used. They are used in ways that these other media are not. People live in them, they change them. It's the same with cities. I mean, city is just a larger scale. And I find that in doing research, the most telling document actually is the city itself. And that, we, as historians, we often read buildings in terms of social context and political context and so on. But I actually think that architecture tells us a lot about all of those contexts and those aspects, because if you understand, architecture organizes space, and it organizes the way in which it creates proximities, it creates distances, it structures the way in which life is lived, and it also is filled with codes. If you look at a house plan, there's the master bedroom, there's the kitchen. All of these things have all kinds of meaning in them. And I think that it's just to decode architecture architecture maybe is the greatest set of codes, in my opinion.
Well, it's actually quite interesting if you take a look at the photographs on the wall. You can read so much into them, and you can learn so much. The dates help, of course, and that was something you had to, you need documentation to do that. But you can read an enormous amount. I think that your example of the interpretation of the Hitchcock Berenice Abbott images of this, and Richard was showing me last night an absolutely fascinating discussion of one of the Fenton photographs of the Valley of the Death, and you know, whether the cannonballs had been there, put there, or whether they before or after the other photograph.
Two versions of the picture,
and so,
on and off.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you know, these interpretations, these research into, you know, the research that photographs actually require and lead to. It's a very different view of the city, I think, when you bring a bunch together. And I think, I don't know how one can continue. You know, I really love this view of Montreal that you get from all those buildings that photographed more or less at the same time and put together. Because that's an entire, you know, there are many books that were written on Montreal, or the cities. I'm not just using Montreal because that's what I was working on, but that give the same buildings, but they're taken by different photographers, and there's no unity, there's no coherence, it's just stuff. And I think that there's a great value in that, to be able to bring that together. And it's, of course, the old art history thing of being able to compare.
Right. Well, I think that, you know, in your understanding of or your sense of the Greystones, you have actually a map in your head. You have a plan. You know how these things fit together. So that...
No.
Well, but I think that even then, you had, first of all, you had a sense of that they were meaningful in some very important way, and that they were meaningful. They said something very important about Montreal, and the fact that you wanted to photograph them in the snow, because they're all about the cold, like today. Yeah, and the toughness.
The snow keeping out the cold.
Exactly, and so that they actually tell, and you intuited this, I guess. I mean, intuition is one of those. It's a
that's
sort of
part
cultural.
of art. Intuition is part of art.
Yes, but in your own mind, those pieces all fit together, and that comes from your knowledge of Montreal, and it comes from also the way in which
I was trying to point out that I learned.
Yeah.
I didn't know most of that material before I took the photographs. It was in taking the photographs that you learned about it.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't that I'm just going out and saying, oh, I like this stuff, and I'll make photographs of it. That wasn't it at all.
No, it was a way of looking and a way of understanding, actually.
Yeah, well, that was the whole point.
Yeah, exactly.
Your comment earlier about consistency made me think of something. Made me think of Google Street View.
Pardon?
Your comment about consistency made me think of Google Street View, because in a way, the courthouse project today, I'm not saying it would be remotely as good, but you could sit alone and kind of go along Google Street View and go to every single one of the courthouses. Yeah. In fact, you could probably write a computer script that would go to all 3,000. My question is, like, today, amidst this proliferation of images, of dinner plates and also buildings, what's the status of the photographic survey? What would it mean today to do that kind of immense work?
The Datar was one of the last things I knew about.
But that came much later. That was in the 80s. Yeah.
Well, when we took up, we did, the photographic study of Montreal was based on no knowledge of anything, but as you said, we went to look at the Library of Congress of the FSA photographs, and this was the first documentation, I think, after that. So that was at 1930s, and so this was in the 40 years later.
Walker Evans worked for the FSA briefly, because he was such an individualist that he couldn't take strikers' instructions. One of the things that he said that's somewhat pertinent, he says, I'm not, I think I've got this right. He said, I'm not a documentary photographer. I work in the documentary style.
Well,
And
that word
there is a
documentary is
difference.
such a problem.
Well, I was going to ask you about that word actually, because you titled, or subtitled, I should say, the courthouse book, A Photographic Document.
Yeah,
Why did you do that?
I think that was me putting a subtitle, basically.
Do you know Berenice Abbott also
Absolutely,
said every photograph is a document.
yes.
It's a photograph, but it is also a document.
Yes, but in most people's minds, a document is not something that's interpreted. It's for real. It's what the thing is, and that's the problem with it.
And the courthouse project was very much an interpretive exercise. It was about assembling
I love that photograph
an
of
idea.
Berenice Abbott, of a building where you've got all the signs down, very carefully composed.
Yeah,
You've got all the signs
on the
down.
right-hand
Right.
edge, yeah.
She could have moved it over.
Oh, no, she
Yeah,
didn't. She
yeah.
needed that.
I think maybe I'll ask one last question, then we can open it up to the audience. Richard, from a very kind of technical, practical perspective, do you think there's any strategies or ways of producing more sort of sober, evidentiary-looking images than not?
Well, sober is. I mean, does one want to be sober always?
Perhaps not right now.
I think one needs some leavening, and I was always trying that very much with both the courthouse project. I was trying to find humor there, and photographers would make pictures. And they'd send them in, and I'd write to them and say, that's a wonderful, witty picture. He said, what do you mean? And the picture itself is a big electric fan leaning, sort of pushed into a corner against the wall. And it's this painted picture of liberty or something behind with the stars and stripes waving in the wind, painted on the wall right behind it. And it's such a wonderful sort of comic counterpoint between the reality of and Tchaikovsky's remark about the dissenting juror. I mean, it's just perfect. And I wanted that aspect of the thing in there. And they're very moving pictures as well. There's a little picture of people who had gone off to fight in the First World War, and they're photographs about large carte de visite size, like about a postcard. And they're mounted in rows and rows on the wall inside the hallway of the courthouse. And the ones who were killed have got a little star on them. And there's a lot of stars. And it's, it just makes you stop, makes you think. And there's one in Colorado with sticks of wheat in cases, real wheat. They probably replace it every harvest festival or something. It's just, there are beautiful things like that.
And then the photographs of events that take place on the courthouse.
Yeah, right.
And then
Fourth of July.
types of sculpture.
Pumpkin Festival, one of Laura's pictures on the courthouse lawn. Just terrific stuff.
But is there anything in a photo, maybe Eve, for you, that would make you suspicious, that would make you distrust it immediately?
I'm not sure that trust is the important word here, that photographs are interpretive, and they do record an event or an object in place and time, and so they're honest. But I think that they're not necessarily about truth. I don't think that truth
That
is...
was, of course, the initial thought about them.
That they were.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
What's the definition of truth?
Well, exactly.
Well, now we need a drink. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Reality.
But it was, and it was the same in architecture at the same time. Actually, in the 19th century, there was something about truth. It had to be, and that architecture was true if it was true to its materials and to its purpose. But I think that it doesn't necessarily. It's not necessarily what's really you know, it's true to itself, let's say. That's the important thing. But I don't think that there's anything false in a photograph like that. It is what it is, right?
Well, you know, it's false. So now, of course, you can just do anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's
So that was just
Photoshop.
I mean,
Yes.
I deploy all the tricks of Photoshop
Yeah.
all the time, you know. But I'm trying to make honest pictures.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, everybody does, and I think that's
But you know, there's also something about the quality of the photograph.
Yes.
For example, Richard was always against our buying negatives. We have 1 or 2 negatives. We've never acquired any because he said it's the way the print is made. And when we were doing these, first of all, taking his negatives, which we have here, of course, and started to print them first, they looked horrible. They looked commercial because they were much too contrast. And so this is, you know, just the very way that the print is made.
Yeah.
And the quality, or else where you stand. You know, if you stand here, the thing comes together, and if you stand over there, it doesn't. So these are all, those are art history kind of problems also.
Yeah. Well, and the materiality of the photograph is what you're talking about too. That you print it, and that it is the print that you're talking about.
Yeah, less and less.
But less and less, exactly.
Unfortunately.
I mean, that doesn't. We don't even have negatives anymore. I
Yeah.
mean,
a few. Yeah.